The night settles over the plains like a soft breath. The Tigris hums its ancient lullaby, and the Euphrates glides slowly, threading through the folds of Mesopotamia. Long before kingdoms fell, long before names were carved into stone, the land dreamed in silence. Here, in the heart of what would become Babylon, time moved like honey. No one rushed, no one feared. The stars blinked slowly in the ink-black sky, as if even the heavens did not yet know what was coming. A boy once walked the river's edge, his feet coated in silt, his hands sticky from dates, watching shadows ripple across the water. He did not know he belonged to a people who would one day build the tallest towers, who would one day disappear without sound. His mother called from the house, low clay walls, roof woven with reeds, air heavy with smoke from cooking fires. They lived simply. They slept with doors open to the wind. They rose when the light stirred and slept when the moon tilted her pale face toward the horizon. No drums, no swords, only life. Soft, warm, and wide like the plain itself. Before war, before noise, there is always a kind of sacred pause. The world holds its breath. We often forget this part of history, but we shouldn't, because it is in the silence before history turns where we find the deepest truths about what it means to be human. And we know you are here tonight to rest, not to fight. We truly love and care for you. Your peace matters. So before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The scribes who lived in early Babylon kept their pens beside them at all hours, carved from reed stalks, their edges split like bird beaks. Their hands were stained with clay, their robes dusted in white powder from tablets that never truly dried. They did not write for fame. They did not expect anyone to remember them. They wrote because the king asked them to. They wrote because they feared forgetting. The tablets they filled with signs and symbols told of grain, of floods, of taxes. But in between, there were smaller stories. A man who planted too early. A woman who never returned from the market. A priest who saw smoke from a distant hill and said nothing. These fragments, barely visible, are where the truth hides. Babylon did not appear overnight. It grew from whispers and footprints, from dried riverbeds and changing winds. Long before it was called a city, it was just a place where people stopped to drink. And then, as if by habit, they began to stay. They built walls, not to keep others out, but to remember where they were. And over time, the walls grew higher. Not because of fear, but because of hope. The hope that something might last. The kings who would later rule Babylon were not born knowing their fate. They were boys once, listening to old men talk about stars and seasons, playing with clay lions, watching fishermen tie boats together with rope. Their mothers gave them bread. Their fathers showed them how to kneel before the gods. Nothing seemed urgent then. Even the storms came slowly. The palace gardens were heavy with scent. Fig and pomegranate, tamarisk and willow. Women moved through them like birds, robes trailing through the grass, quiet laughter mixing with the sound of fountains. The air shimmered with heat, and the sun painted the walls with gold. Babylon was not just a city. It was a pattern of shadow and sound, where everything had its place. The baker knew when to light his fires. The guard knew when the sun would strike the tower roof. A whisper could pass from temple to tavern, without raising a breeze. In these early days, the city did not yet fear its own weight. It danced beneath its own architecture. The ziggurat rose slowly, step by step, shaped like a mountain made by hand. Workers climbed each tier, carrying bricks still warm from the kiln. They sang to keep time. Their voices were dry from dust, but steady. They did not know that centuries later, people would wonder how it was made, or why. To them, it was not a wonder. It was work. The priests watched from above, their eyes ringed with coal, their fingers wrapped in cords. They studied the clouds. They read the livers of animals. They asked the stars if the gods were pleased. And sometimes they said yes, even if they were not sure. In the center of the city, beside the great temples and merchant halls, families lived in houses packed close together, their rooftops flat, their walls the color of bone. At night, children whispered across alleys, voices floating like moths in the dark. The city did not sleep easily, but it slept together. Sometimes, late in the season when the river was low, the fishermen would say the gods were walking along the banks. They said the footsteps of Marduk were so heavy they made the fish swim deeper. In truth, it was just the wind, or maybe the change in the tide. But the story mattered more than the fact. Babylon was built on such stories. Stories that turned stone into memory. The sky in those early centuries held no hint of punishment. It was large and blue and kind, stretching endlessly over the sprawl of the city. If there were omens, they were gentle ones. A bird that flew too low, a well that gave too much water. Nothing to fear. The people traded in wool and wine. They raised goats that wandered freely across rooftops. Children drew in the dust with sticks, while elders counted shipments of barley with beads. The city ran on rhythm, a quiet rhythm, the kind you only notice when it breaks. Outside the gates, the world kept turning. Small tribes moved along the fringes. Foreign languages curled at the edges of the empire. But the heart of Babylon beat steady. There were still songs sung to the moon. There were still feasts held at the solstice. A new king would rise soon, one who believed he could outlast time. But even he did not know how quickly foundations crack. For now, though, the sky over Babylon remained unbroken. The wind passed gently over its towers, and the world, for one more season, allowed it to rest. The temples of Babylon did not echo with thunder. Their silence was heavier than any voice. Behind the thick doors of cedar and bronze, priests moved without sound, their hands wrapped in linen, their faces shadowed beneath tall headdresses. They read omens with trembling patience. They offered prayers in voices that barely rose above breath. And yet, beneath the stillness, something had shifted. The statues of the gods, once polished and perfumed, began to wear a thin coat of dust. The offerings were smaller. The incense burned quicker. And though no one said it aloud, people felt that the gods might be listening less. In the corridors of power, messengers arrived more frequently. Horses covered in foam, tablets wrapped in cloth, news from the north, from the east. Lands where strange kings stirred and boundaries once believed eternal began to tremble. The scribes recorded the names of these new kings, though they did not know how to pronounce them. Elamite, Median, Persian. Words that felt like dry leaves. The older priests scoffed. They said all empires rise, all empires fall, but not Babylon, not the city blessed by Marduk, not the navel of the world. Still, the guards at the city gates began to carry longer spears. Traders were asked more questions, and the river, once calm, seemed to run a little faster. In this slow tension, the people of Babylon adjusted without knowing it. A mother hurried her child inside sooner. A merchant hid a few extra coins in a jar beneath his floor. A priest hesitated before interpreting the stars. Fear never arrives all at once. It seeps in. In the shadow of the temples, the air thickened with rumors. They were not shouted. They were whispered between baskets of figs and behind cracked doorways. Someone said a distant city had stopped paying tribute. Someone else said soldiers had been seen near the Zagros Mountains. The king's advisors dismissed it all. They reminded the people that Babylon had endured floods, famine, and rebellion before. The city's gods were ancient, its walls too thick, its enemies too far. But the soil began to dry differently that year. The crops sprouted late. The river's color shifted. Farmers stared at the sky, and did not know what to ask. In the quiet heart of the city, the ziggurat stood like a mountain carved by memory. Each brick had been set with faith, but faith, like stone, can crack. In the markets, the price of dates rose, bread grew thinner, and the sound of coins changed. Foreign silver began to appear, coins stamped with symbols no Babylonian child could name. Still, life went on. The people endured, as they always had. But a new kind of silence filled the streets. Not the peaceful silence of night, but the hollow silence of waiting. Children still laughed, but less freely. Dogs barked at strangers more quickly, and in the temples, the fire in the sacred brazier burned lower, though no one dared admit it. One night, a shepherd returned from the western hills and spoke of torches on the horizon. He swore they weren't stars. He said they moved like an army. His voice shook, but the elders told him to rest. Perhaps they wished they could believe him. Perhaps they already did. To understand how Babylon began to fracture, you must look not only at swords, but at seeds. The structure of an empire depends on many quiet agreements, taxes paid, alliances held, prayers spoken. But when these begin to fray, the center becomes heavy. The provinces furthest from Babylon had begun to stir. Not with revolt, but with doubt. The messengers they sent came less often. The tribute they owed arrived lighter. The local governors, once loyal, now whispered in unfamiliar dialects. Some prayed to different gods. Some looked east, toward a power they barely understood, but instinctively feared. Babylon, once the heart of a world, now felt the world grow colder, and the king, surrounded by scrolls and generals, began to make choices that no longer rippled with confidence. He raised new taxes to rebuild defenses. He conscripted young men with softer hands. He sent envoys to distant cities, their gifts generous, their messages uncertain. Meanwhile, the merchants who once flowed freely through Babylon's gates began to slow. Caravans paused at border towns. Stories spread of routes less safe, of new tolls, of travelers who vanished. Trade, once Babylon's lifeblood, now pulsed unevenly. And within the city, a low unease took hold. Temples remained open, but fewer candles were lit. The songs of praise grew shorter. Some priests, privately, questioned the silence of the heavens. They wondered if Marduk had turned his gaze, not in anger, but in sorrow. The people, too, began to watch the sky differently, as if waiting for something. A sign, a voice, but none came. Beneath all of this, the coin spoke loudest. Silver and barley had once bound Babylon to its provinces like threads in a great cloak. Now, the threads wore thin. In border towns, rival powers began to mint their own promises. They offered trade without taxes, protection without tribute, words that seduced the weary. Babylon's scribes noticed. They recorded each rumor with care, their styluses carving warnings into clay. But clay tablets are not soldiers, and tablets cannot feed the hungry. In the city itself, tension grew in quiet places. A butcher raised his prices. A teacher closed his doors early. A boy was beaten for speaking a foreign phrase. These were not decrees from a king. These were the movements of a body slowly realizing it was bleeding. One morning, a temple servant found the sacred well dry. He told no one, simply walked home. That evening, he packed his things and joined a caravan leaving through the northern gate. He was never seen again. These small departures added up. Babylon was not falling, not yet. But it had begun to forget how to stand still. And in the east, beyond the mountains, the Persians watched. Patient, quiet, learning the rhythm of the empire's breath. The king of Babylon still believed his walls could hold back time. But walls built by human hands do not stop what is already inside. They only delay it. It never begins the way you expect. The first flames of conflict do not roar. They flicker. They hide in words and disappear in laughter. Babylon, so certain in its silence, did not notice the heat at first. It began in the voices of men who no longer bowed when summoned, in letters that arrived late with seals unfamiliar. A city far to the east sent no grain that season. Another returned its tribute unopened. These were gestures so small they might have gone unseen in a younger empire. But Babylon had grown old. Its walls were not only stone, they were habit, memory, pride. And now, one by one, the cracks spread. The king remained calm in public, but those near him began to speak in shorter sentences. The scribes dipped their pens more often, and in the great hall where decisions once echoed with confidence, there was hesitation. Still, Babylon did not shout. It waited. It watched. But the outer provinces had already begun to shift their weight. In marketplaces near the border, new accents were heard. Persian, Median. Traders who spoke little but watched everything. A soldier stationed near the eastern frontier wrote home that the caravans now moved under escort, not Babylonian. He said the faces were polite, but the eyes were cold. He said the road felt narrower than before. His message arrived weeks later, folded in oilskin. It was not answered. Within the walls, the city's rhythm continued. But now the music was slower. Fewer hands played the lyres at dusk. Children were called indoors sooner. Temples kept their doors open longer, as if searching the sky for answers. And in the corners of the palace there were new voices. Advisors who spoke of rising powers, of distant alliances forming without permission. Their warnings were dismissed at first. Babylon had heard such things before. But behind the words, there was something different. Not panic, just the soft weight of realization. That something far beyond the horizon had started walking toward them, and it would not stop. One night, beneath a moon that seemed too pale, the king summoned his eldest generals. Their robes dragged softly on the stone. Their faces bore the memory of 100 skirmishes, 1,000 maps. They stood silently as the king asked whether the eastern threat was real. They said little, but one man, old, half-blind in one eye, spoke a truth no one wished to hear. He said, "We have ruled too long to see clearly." No one argued. Afterward, they ate together in silence. A fire burned low in the center of the chamber. The food tasted of ash. The first real sign came not from the east, but from within. A small rebellion in a village near the river. Magistrate refused to enforce the king's grain laws. He and his sons took shelter in a shrine, and when guards came, they found the shrine empty. The family had fled. No one knew where. Some said north. Others whispered south, toward the Persian road. What mattered more was the hesitation. The time it took for the king's forces to react. The time it took for them to care. In another year, another reign, the rebellion would have been crushed before morning. But now the court debated. Some said to send an army, others said to wait. In the end, the city returned to silence, but something had changed. The streets no longer felt like home to everyone. Foreigners moved through the markets with a quiet boldness. Their jewelry bore different symbols. Their prayers pointed in unfamiliar directions. Still, there was no open fighting, only the kind of discomfort that grows in the spaces between certainty. One morning, a statue of Marduk was found toppled in a small neighborhood. No one claimed it. No one saw it fall. But the priest assigned to that shrine packed his belongings that night. He left without a word. His name was never spoken again. There were still days when the sun shone like it had before. Still days when music rose from courtyards and lovers kissed behind market stalls. But underneath, the current ran colder. Babylon was not yet defeated. But it had begun to lose its sense of direction. The guards at the gates no longer recognized all the merchants. Some carried passes from unknown provinces. Some said nothing, only smiled. And the king, once majestic in his stillness, now walked more slowly. His robes seemed heavier. His eyes paused too long on the horizon. He had ruled long enough to remember better seasons, but even he now dreamt of fires, of unfamiliar faces climbing the walls, of the river turning away. In private, he asked the priests if the gods still listened. They lied gently, not out of cruelty, but from habit. Babylon was a city that believed in its own eternity. To speak of endings would have been the worst kind of profanity, but the people could feel it. In the way birds scattered too quickly, in the way shadows lingered too long, in the way the stars no longer seemed to move. The city that had once lit the world now began to dim, slowly, quietly, like a candle burning through its final pool of oil. They came not as invaders, but as footsteps in the distance. You could feel them before you could see them. The march of power begins that way, distant, rhythmic, too far to be a threat, too near to ignore. From the eastern lands, from places where the mountains meet the sky and the languages taste like stone, the Persian tide began to move. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply advanced. Behind them came stories. Stories of discipline, of swift roads and silent warriors. Stories of a new king, quiet and measured, who spoke little but listened well. Cyrus. The name arrived in Babylon long before he did. Spoken, first by traders, then by scribes, then by the priests who tried to pretend they weren't listening. He was said to be unlike other kings, not wild with glory, not drunk on conquest, but something colder, something certain. Babylon did not fear him, not yet. It had seen kings before, but even the bravest wall begins to shrink when a shadow falls across it every day. The people did not panic. They watched. And when no orders came, they returned to their lives. The river still moved. The sun still touched the ziggurat. But the soldiers began to drill more often, and the old generals returned to court, their silence deeper than before. The army that gathered beyond the eastern edge of Babylon's world did not wear the marks of desperation. It was not a force held together by hunger or pride. It was something else. It was method. It moved across the plains with dustless grace, as if the ground had been waiting for its weight. Babylon's scouts watch from a distance. They report formation, speed, and silence. The kind of silence that unnerves even the most faithful guard. The king summoned his council. This time, the names on the tablets were different. The most trusted advisors had grown old or withdrawn. In their place were men whose voices cracked with caution. They spoke of waiting, of walls, of Babylon's natural strength. But the truth sat unspoken in the room. Cyrus did not need to scream. His power was not in thunder. It was in momentum. Outside the city, new fortifications were ordered. Engineers from the west arrived, shaking their heads quietly at the dry mortar and tired hands. Inside the city, food was stored in greater amounts, but grain spoils, oil leaks, and fear, once invited, never leaves. The priests began to offer prayers more frequently, not to plead for victory, but for clarity. But even the gods were silent now. The letters began to arrive at the gates like drifting leaves, written in careful script, sealed with foreign marks, not declarations of war, but invitations, promises. Join us and be spared. Submit, and Babylon will remain untouched. The messengers were not soldiers. They were scholars, poets, men with robes too clean for the road. They stood with calm smiles, offering peace written in languages that had not yet settled into law. The king of Babylon refused them. He did not speak with men who offered surrender before a sword was drawn. And yet, the city heard. Whispers ran faster than orders. Some merchants pulled their wagons earlier than usual. Some craftsmen sent their families westward. Not many. Not enough to draw notice, but enough to shift the feeling of the air. The march of power is not only about armies, it is about timing. The Persians had found Babylon not in weakness, but in hesitation. They watched from beyond the river's curve. They waited for the cracks to spread. And inside the city, as guards stood longer watch and firewood was stacked higher, The king looked out over his people and did not speak. The voice of the empire was beginning to dry in his throat. Even the scribes could see it. They began writing fewer praises and more records. Autumn came early that year. The winds turned colder, the stars sharpened, and though no arrows had been fired, Babylon was already bleeding in spirit. The court meetings grew longer, but resolved less. Some ministers spoke of surrender in private. Others, louder in public, insisted the city could endure any siege, but no siege had come, only the press of time. Cyrus was still waiting, and in that waiting, he grew larger. His army moved closer by inches. The scouts returned with stories of roads built behind the marching lines, of bridges that crossed rivers no one had thought passable, of cities that surrendered without a fight. Cyrus did not plunder. He absorbed. He offered his vision like a mirror. To join him was to continue living. And many, tired of war, found the offer difficult to refuse. But Babylon was different. It had known glory. It had been the center of the world. To yield even gently would be to unmake its identity. And so, the city did not speak the word surrender. Not yet. Instead, it stared outward, toward the mountains, toward the fireless sky. And the king, once wrapped in ceremony, sat longer in silence. He asked fewer questions. He offered fewer commands, as if he too were waiting for the sound of footsteps, for the moment the dust of Persia would finally touch Babylonian stone. The world around Babylon was beginning to catch fire, though no flames yet licked the city walls. Beyond the horizon, smoke rose like distant ghosts, restless and unseen. The once steady rhythm of the river faltered, as if the waters themselves sensed the shifting tides of fate. The air grew heavy with uncertainty, carrying whispers from every corner of the empire, words spoken in marketplaces, murmured prayers in half-forgotten temples, and the silent glance exchanged between strangers passing through crowded streets. Cities that once basked in Babylon's shadow now trembled beneath the weight of change. Some fell quietly, their gates unbarred, their voices fading like distant echoes. Others resisted, their fires burning bright but quickly swallowed by darkness. The trade routes, once veins of life, became tangled paths strewn with doubt and fear. Each traveler carried stories of destruction and loss, families scattered, fields burned, temples abandoned. The land, which had cradled Babylon's power for centuries, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Inside Babylon, the atmosphere thickened with a sense of creeping despair. The bustling markets slowed, their colors muted by the fading sun. Merchants wrapped their wares tightly, voices softer, eyes more watchful. The scent of spices and fresh bread mingled uneasily with the sharp tang of smoke, carried on the wind. Mothers held their children close, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to their own ears. Temples, once filled with song, now echoed with silence, the altars gathering dust beneath heavy shadows. The priests moved like ghosts through empty chambers, their rituals smaller, their prayers quieter. Even the gods seemed distant, their presence a fading light behind stained walls. The ziggurat, that great mountain of stone and memory, stood watchful but weary, its steps worn smooth by the passage of time and fear. In the quiet corners of the city, eyes met in wordless understanding, each person carrying the weight of uncertainty, knowing that the world as they knew it was slipping away. The river, once the lifeblood of Babylon, flowed slower, its waters thickened with silt and sorrow. Fishermen cast their nets with less hope, their boats drifting listlessly beneath skies heavy with ash. The crops along the banks faltered, the fields turning brittle under a sun that no longer promised harvest. Hunger crept into homes like a shadow, soft at first, then growing sharper with each passing day. The city's granaries, once overflowing with abundance, now held only memories of plenty. The kings who had ruled from golden thrones were gone, their names fading like smoke on the wind. Their promises, once carved into stone and sung in praise, were now whispers in empty halls. The people clung to routines, trying to anchor themselves in the familiar, but even the smallest tasks felt heavy with the weight of loss. The silence between footsteps grew longer. The night stretched wider, and in the hearts of those who remained, a quiet fear took root, waiting to bloom. Beyond the gates, the armies that had once seemed distant were now nearer than ever. The dust of their passage settled on rooftops and streets, carried on a wind that spoke of conquest and change. The soldiers moved with a steady purpose, their faces unreadable beneath helmets forged from foreign metal. They did not shout. They did not raise banners high. Their presence was a slow, inevitable tide, pressing against the walls, waiting for the moment to break. In the palaces, the king watched from shadowed windows, his gaze heavy with the knowledge of what must come. The great halls, once alive with celebration and power, were quiet now, save for the soft footsteps of those who served. The fires in the braziers burned low, the smoke curling upward in thin, mournful trails. And in the streets below, the people whispered of fate, of gods who had turned away, and of a city holding its final breath before the storm. Babylon was no longer the unshakable heart of the world. It was a fragile dream, flickering on the edge of night. Within the city walls, the war's reach grew silent but no less devastating. Mothers cradled children who no longer laughed with the same ease. Their eyes, wide and wary, carried questions without answers. Streets that once rang with the playful shouts of youth grew quieter, the laughter retreating like a tide pulled by an unseen hand. Markets that overflowed with colour now displayed less bounty. Baskets once brimming with fresh fruit and woven goods stood half empty, and the clatter of coins was softer, less frequent. The scent of warm bread was often replaced by the faint odour of smoke and dust. Families gathered in dimly lit homes, speaking in hushed tones about missing sons, about men who left and never returned. The war was no longer fought on distant fields, but lived in the empty chairs around dinner tables. It was a wound worn beneath the skin, unseen but deeply felt. The city's pulse slowed. Temples that once welcomed throngs of worshippers now sheltered only a few. Priests moved through shadowed halls, their voices low and prayer subdued. The rituals continued, though their meaning felt stretched thin by the weight of loss. Altars once bright with offerings grew sparse. The gods, long trusted to protect and guide, seemed distant, their presence retreating behind stone and silence. Some whispered that the heavens had grown tired of Babylon's pride. Others said the gods mourned quietly alongside the people. The ziggurat, still standing tall, cast long shadows across empty plazas where festivals were once held. The city's heart beat slower, each thump echoing with memory and grief. Mothers wept in secret, mourning not only sons lost to battle, but the loss of a world they once knew. Fathers too weary to speak sat beneath fading banners, their hands folded in silent despair. Every day carried its own quiet battle. Children counted the days between meals, learning early the shape of hunger. Old friends no longer met beneath the fig trees. Fear made them strangers. The baker's oven cooled as flour became scarce. The laughter in the courtyards was replaced by whispered fears. Soldiers marched through the streets, their armor dull, their faces marked by exhaustion. They no longer carried the fire of hope. Instead, they carried the weight of survival. Families packed their belongings, ready to flee if the gates opened. The city's walls, once symbols of protection, now felt like tombstones. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion, wondering who might betray whom. The war had woven itself into the fabric of everyday life, threading distrust, sorrow, and quiet courage in equal measure. Songs that once lifted the spirits of the city grew faint. The melodies that drifted from courtyards were slower, tinged with melancholy. Musicians played on worn strings, their fingers trembling with fatigue. The dancers moved less freely, their steps heavy with remembrance. In the darkened corners of taverns, voices spoke in tones low enough not to carry beyond the walls. Stories of lost friends, of battles fought and families shattered, passed from mouth to mouth. Yet in this landscape of sorrow, the people held on. They remembered what had been. They whispered prayers for what might still be. And beneath it all, beneath the grief and the silence, a fragile hope endured. It was not loud, was not bold, but it was there, woven into the quiet bravery of those who refused to forget. There were days when nothing happened. No messenger arrived. No orders were issued. No horns sounded from the towers. In these moments, Babylon held its breath. The silence between battles is not peace. It is the long, slow ache of waiting. In this space, memory does not rest. It sharpens. The streets of Babylon moved gently, as if aware that each sound might shatter something delicate. Shopkeepers opened their doors, but with hesitation. Bread was baked, but in smaller loaves. Conversations happened, but always in corners, never in crowds. The sky remained wide and open, but the people no longer looked up. They kept their eyes on the dust beneath their feet, tracing invisible patterns as if listening for something beneath the earth. The city, though still whole, felt hollow. Like a bell no longer rung, like a prayer no longer spoken. It was in this quiet that the deepest wounds were formed. By midday, shadows fell in the wrong direction. The sun seemed to watch without warmth. People moved through the light, but did not trust it. In the narrow alleys behind the temples, children played with stones, but without laughter. Their games had changed. They no longer played at being kings or gods. Now they mimicked soldiers, carried sticks as spears, and argued over who would fall first. Mothers watched from doorways but said nothing. It was easier not to interrupt. In another part of the city, an old man carved lines into his wall, one for each day since the last battle. The wall was nearly full. He said nothing to his neighbors, only nodded as they passed. And at night, he stared at those marks, as if hoping to remember what the days between them had meant. Babylon's silence was not from lack of sound. It was from the weight of what remained unspoken. Somewhere near the palace, a scribe walked alone along the edge of the garden. He carried no tablet, no pen, just his hands, folded and empty. He had written the names of kings, victories, lineages, and laws. Now, he wrote nothing. The words no longer arrived. Not because the events had stopped, but because the meaning had. He passed under fig trees that no longer bore fruit. He listened to the breeze moving through dry branches. It was the same breeze that once carried music and the sound of foreign languages bartering in the market. Now it carried only dust. He remembered a woman who once sold grapes in the plaza, her voice like water over smooth stone. He had not seen her in months. Perhaps she had fled. Perhaps not. He did not ask. In silence, even memory loses its edges. The scribe sat beside the cracked fountain and watched the sky darken. He did not cry. He simply waited. The walls of Babylon were still tall. The bricks were still strong. But they no longer comforted those inside. For what is a wall if you fear what waits within it more than what stands outside? The guards still walked the ramparts. Their feet made soft thuds on the stone. They did not speak to one another unless necessary. Each step was a reminder that they were watching not for an enemy, but for a sign. The sky might break. The river might rise. The city might fracture from within. They watched for these things, but nothing happened. And in that nothing, they grew weary. Beneath the tower steps, a boy, too young to serve, slept curled against the base of the gate. His father was stationed at the northern wall. His mother had stopped waiting. The boy did not speak. He did not beg. He simply slept, wrapped in a woven cloth. listening to the silence like it was a song he had always known. Babylon waited, and in its waiting, it wept, quietly, without tears, like a dream left unfinished. There are moments in history that bend, not with force, but with quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Promises given in shadow. Words spoken with eyes turned toward the floor. Babylon, proud and weathered, stood at the edge of such a moment. The stillness that had settled over the city began to change shape, not with thunder, but with the soft weight of compromise. Far from the noise of swords and flame, men gathered in narrow rooms to speak of futures not yet born. Some of these men wore Babylonian robes, some did not. And though they all used different words, their meaning was the same. Something must end for something else to begin. The old king, tired in his bones, no longer heard the full length of these meetings. His silence was no longer strategy. It was surrender. In the palace, once a place of ceremony and rule, his footsteps echoed too loudly. The tapestries hung limp. The bronze gates were polished less often, and still the Persian shadow grew longer. To the east, across the broad sweep of dust and road, Cyrus watched and waited. He did not rush the city. He had no need. What he desired would come to him. His men, disciplined and quiet, pitched no wasteful fires. They listened more than they spoke. They studied maps drawn by Babylonian hands, and they paid attention to who among the city's officials no longer believed. A letter arrived at the Persian camp, written by a trembling hand. It did not beg. It did not confess. It only explained the weight of crumbling trust. The writer promised to open a gate at a time not yet fixed. In exchange, the safety of his household. His name was not known to the general Persian command. It did not need to be. Babylon, in its slow decay, had begun to shed its own protection, not in blood, but in broken loyalties. The guards who once walked the perimeter now looked inward. The priests continued their prayers, but fewer gods were listening. And the river, winding through the city like a serpent grown old, began to swell at its edges. Within the city, small things began to vanish. A statue removed from a shrine, a clerk who no longer opened his stall, a captain whose name was no longer called at roll. These disappearances were not noted, officially. They were felt, like absences in a dream. The people noticed, but they did not speak. There was a shared understanding now that words had weight, and some weights could drown. In the lower districts, where the stone gave way to mud and clay, families began to leave under night's cover. They took what they could, not in panic, but in quiet readiness. A woman rolled up a prayer mat and placed it between loaves of bread. A boy clutched a tablet with the name of a god he was too young to understand. They passed the gates without protest. Fewer questions were asked. The soldiers at the outposts knew the answers would change soon. Better to let people go than to witness what came next. In the great halls, where kings had once spoken with the force of thunder, only soft voices remained. The throne sat empty more often. The court scribes wrote less. A history paused itself. Then came the broken promise. One of the outer provinces, still held under Babylon's seal, pledged its allegiance to Persia. The seal was returned, cracked down the center. It was not defiance. It was weariness. They no longer believed in protection from the West. Cyrus's men, in response, did nothing. No punishments, no triumph. Only the acknowledgement that another thread had unraveled. Inside Babylon, the mood shifted. Not to fear, but to expectation. The people now walked with eyes trained to the horizon. The silence between them was no longer strained. It had become routine. There was no uprising, no riots, only the sense that something familiar was ending. A musician played near the temple steps, an old tune that mothers used to sing. No one stopped to listen, but no one asked him to leave. And as his song faded into the dust-filled air, the wind picked up. carrying with it the first breath of a new rule. Not yet here, but very close. Close enough to feel in the bones. Babylon, once the voice of the world, was preparing to go quiet. The tide does not turn all at once. It gathers in stillness. It moves beneath the surface, quietly, patiently, wearing away at what once seemed unshakable. Babylon had not fallen. Not yet. But it no longer stood the way it once did. Every part of the city had grown quieter. Not in peace, but in anticipation. The sky felt lower. The wind carried the scent of dry earth. Men and women went about their daily tasks, as if caught in a dream they could not wake from. The priests still lit their sacred fires, but the smoke drifted unevenly, as though the heavens no longer breathed it in. The walls still stood high above the plains, but their stones looked darker now, not from ash, but from time. On the eastern edge of the empire, Cyrus had not issued new threats. His army did not march louder, it simply continued, always steady, always sure. More cities stepped aside, more governors opened their gates. The world was not being taken. It was stepping aside to make room for something else. The people within Babylon could feel it, not as a blow, but as a slow parting. Like curtains drawn back before a final act. The old name still held weight, but less than before. Nabonidus, once spoken with reverence or fear, was now mentioned less and less. And Belshazzar, the crown prince who had taken his father's place in the city, grew restless in his rule. He ordered more feasts, more proclamations. He clung to ritual, but his eyes betrayed him. They looked beyond the walls, beyond the palace, into the shadow that grew larger each day. In the corridors of power, the golden floors echoed with fewer footsteps. Courtiers made themselves scarce, the air was cooler, the silence deeper. And though no battle had begun, the city was already defending something it could no longer define. Along the riverbanks, fishermen returned with lighter catches. They blamed the changing tides, but their voices lacked conviction. The Euphrates, once the city's beating heart, began to move differently. Engineers reported unusual flows. The water shifted strangely at night, low in the channels, higher by dawn. Most paid it no mind. A river changes, but some saw the pattern. Some watched and understood. The Persians were not at the gates, but they were near the water. They had studied the river long enough to see where it thinned, where it could be guided, bent, broken. Babylon's great walls, built over generations, had not been designed for such quiet, creeping strategy. Inside the city, the people felt something unnatural stirring. A tightness in the wind, a stillness in the birds, an unease that clung to doorways and rooftops. Children no longer asked questions. They simply listened, their small hands holding onto their parents' robes. The old stories that once comforted, of gods who protected, of kings who conquered, no longer filled the silence. And at night, the stars seemed to blink more slowly, as if watching with heavy eyes. Belshazzar, desperate to summon confidence, called for a feast greater than any before. He invited nobles, generals, priests, any who still held claim to power. Golden cups were brought from the temples, their sacred carvings gleaming in firelight. The wine flowed freely. Music filled the halls, but there was no joy, only noise. Behind every toast, a tremble. Behind every laugh, a question unspoken. That night, the stories say, something appeared on the wall. A message not written by hand. A message no priest could read. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The words shimmered in torchlight, carved by silence itself. No one could explain it, but everyone understood. A judgment, a weight, a warning. The feast did not end in violence. It simply unraveled. One by one, guests slipped away. The music faded, and Belshazzar sat alone, the golden cup trembling in his hand. Somewhere deep within the palace, a door was left open. And outside the city, The river moved. The night Babylon fell was not filled with screaming. No walls were broken. No torches lit the sky. The Persians came through the riverbed. They had diverted the Euphrates just enough. The water dropped. The channels dried. And the soldiers walked in through what had once been the city's protection. The gates along the water had not been locked. Some say they had been left open. Others say the guards had simply stopped believing. In the early hours before dawn, Persian soldiers moved through the streets with the precision of silence. No fires, no shouting, just footsteps and shadows. By the time the sun rose, the city had changed hands. There was no siege, no heroic stand, just the slow, soft shifting of one world into another. In the palace, Belshazzar was gone. Some say he fell by the sword, others say he vanished into the dark. The people woke to find new banners, new orders, new voices in the square, but no destruction. The temples remained. The walls stood. And yet, everything was different. Babylon had not been conquered in the old way. It had been replaced, not with blood, but with breath. A tide turned not with roar, but with restraint. And in that quiet, the last great empire of Mesopotamia gave way to another. The world turned, and Babylon faded. A fall is not always a moment. Often it is a collection of smaller slips, quiet and unseen, that carry a civilization from certainty to shadow. After the Persians took Babylon, life continued, but it did not return. The sun still rose above the ziggurat, but the light felt thinner. People walked the same streets, but their footsteps had changed. The city was intact, but its soul had shifted. 1,000 small defeats settled into the lives of the people like dust between stones. They were not beaten with iron or flame. They were worn down by new customs, softer rules, quieter control. A child who once learned to write the names of Babylonian kings was now taught to inscribe the name of Cyrus. The temple calendars changed, the rhythms of worship altered, not abolished, but adjusted. The gods still had names, but their voices were harder to hear. The priests, now older and quieter, nodded their heads when Persian officials passed. They spoke less often. Some left their temples altogether. The rituals grew shorter, the silences longer, and the people, unsure of what to hold on to, folded their memories carefully and kept them hidden. Trade returned, markets reopened, coins changed hands, but they bore the image of a different king. The new silver was clean, sharp, efficient, but it did not hum with the weight of centuries. Merchants sold their goods in the same stalls, but they no longer spoke of empire. They spoke of harvests, of border roads, of distant capitals where decisions were made in languages not their own. A man who once wore embroidered robes of state now kept account books for a tax officer. He did not complain. He still ate. But sometimes at night, he walked the old palace walls and whispered the names of kings no one answered to anymore. The banners had changed, but it was not the cloth that mattered. It was the eyes of the people, eyes that no longer looked up with pride, only with quiet endurance. This too was a kind of defeat. Not the kind carved in stone, but the kind carried in silence. In the houses near the river, children grew up without memory of the storm. They heard stories from their grandparents, soft tales of hanging gardens, of festivals that lit the night with flame and music. But to them, these were no different than myths. They had never seen the city celebrate. Their Babylon was calm, orderly, a place of caution. Their dreams reached towards a different center now. Susa, Persepolis, cities where power lived. Babylon had become a station, not a source. The scribes still worked, but their tablets grew thinner, their writing simpler. A few continued to carve records into clay, but many now used ink on parchment. Faster, lighter, easier to forget. The language changed. The forms softened. One dialect replaced another, and then another. Until one day, no one remembered how to read the oldest signs. A scribe, alone in the archives, once tried to teach the younger men the old script. They listened politely, then returned to the new forms. The tablets gathered dust. The temples did not collapse. They simply emptied. The great statues stood, watching over fewer and fewer worshippers. Offerings still arrived, but less frequently. A bowl of grain here, a folded cloth there. The priests who remained began to write prayers to more than one god. Just in case, the lines blurred, the sacred laws softened, and the names of the gods grew unfamiliar even to those who still served them. One temple became a storage hall, another was locked. The ziggurats still climbed into the sky, but the stairs were less worn. Fewer climbed them. No incense burned at the summit. The view remained. Vast plains, far mountains, a sky too wide to fill, but there were no longer voices lifted in devotion. Only the wind. In time, even the stones began to settle. Babylon had not fallen in fire. It had not been leveled. It had not been wiped from the map. It had slowly and gently been let go. Forgotten not by force, but by passage. The weight of 1,000 small defeats pressed down over years, until even memory yielded. The final offensives did not come with horns or banners. They arrived in silence, in the slow erosion of identity, in the fading of customs once kept like fire. Babylon, still standing, still proud in stone, had long since ceased to be the Babylon that ruled. It had become something else, a memory performing itself. A city that looked like power but moved like absence. The Persian administration made its presence known not with violence, but with instruction. Governors were replaced with satraps. Laws were rewritten with softer language and firmer consequence. Soldiers no longer marched, they patrolled. In the center of the city, the palace still housed men who gave orders, but their voices echoed into halls that had forgotten how to obey. Each edict translated across languages lost something in meaning. Each document, stamped and filed, marked another corner of Babylon no longer its own. Some of the city's leaders remained. They dressed as before. They attended councils, but their words served other kings. Their loyalty no longer belonged to the walls they walked within. It belonged to a larger empire, colder, quieter, further away. In this new rhythm, finality did not roar. It hummed. Beyond the ziggurat, in the homes of artisans and workers, the change was slower but no less sure. Weavers began to copy patterns from distant cities. Potters shaped their clay with foreign curves. Even the looms spoke another language now, not because they were forced to, but because that was where the coin came from. A young girl who once traced the shapes of Ishtar's star with her finger in the dust now learned the symbols of Ahura Mazda. Not in rebellion, not in fear, but because it was what her teacher had been taught. Stories from older generations were still told, but with less urgency. A boy asked his grandfather about the great lion statues. The old man looked at him for a long time before answering. His words came slowly, as if retrieving them from a place far underwater. "They used to watch over us," he said, "but now they only watch." The boy nodded and said nothing. That night, he dreamed of lions that could no longer roar. The temple walls still stood. The sacred platforms still rose into the open sky. But the hymns that once echoed through their chambers had become whispers. And then, nothing at all. The priests who remained kept the rituals moving like clockwork, but their hands moved from memory, not meaning. Their eyes drifted while the incense curled. A sacrifice was offered to a god whose name no longer stirred the air. Outside, the city moved on. New Year's arrived, marked by unfamiliar holidays. The festivals of old, with their coloured banners and river processions, were spoken of as curiosities, then as myths, then not at all. One spring, the temple gates were left closed during a solstice. No one complained. No one asked why. A boy who had once trained to become a priest instead became a clerk in a Persian court. He wrote neatly. He smiled when spoken to. And though he passed the temple each day, he never looked inside. Even the stones seemed to shift in place, not falling, not failing, just becoming something no longer noticed. There were still acts of resistance, but not the kind sung about in story. They were small, private, soft. An old woman who refused to trade her clay amulet for a stamped coin. A father who taught his daughter the old calendar under the stars. A man who refused to burn the tablet inscribed with his grandfather's name. These were not victories. They did not stop the turning of the wheel, but they slowed its forgetting. And in that slowness, something human endured. The Persians, to their credit, did not destroy Babylon. They incorporated it. They renamed some streets, they remeasured fields, but they let it breathe, just enough to fade on its own. And fade it did. Not in war, but in weary repetition. Every year, fewer people remembered how it had once been. Every year, fewer people cared. Babylon had been built to last, and it did. Its bricks remained. Its walls endured. But no war can be fought forever. And when the swords are sheathed, it is memory that is conquered next. Final offensives, in the end, are not fought with armies. They are fought with time. Collapse is never sudden. It comes like twilight, slow and quiet, folding the edges of a world until there is nothing left but shadow. Babylon's collapse did not come with the clashing of swords or the roar of battle cries. It came with silence, with absence, with the soft closing of doors once open wide. The city's pulse, once strong and steady, faltered beneath the weight of shifting empires and forgotten loyalties. Streets that had echoed with life grew empty. Markets that once bustled with goods and voices fell into stillness, dust settling where laughter had been. The mighty walls stood like silent witnesses, their bricks worn and cracked, unable to hold back the inevitable. Within the palace, chambers lay vacant. Thrones that had held kings were now empty, draped in silence. The courtiers and officials who once filled the halls had vanished into history, their names whispered only by the wind. Babylon was no longer a beacon. It was a memory fading beneath layers of time. As the empire that had held it together loosened its grasp, the city fragmented. Neighbors who once shared bread and stories now retreated behind closed doors. Trust, like the city's fortunes, eroded. The great temples, which had stood for centuries as places of worship and community, saw fewer visitors. The sacred fires dimmed, flickering in the growing darkness. Priests, once keepers of divine law, found their roles diminished, their voices unheard. The gods they served seemed distant, absent, as if even the heavens had turned away. Outside the city walls, the land began to reclaim what had once been taken. Fields were left fallow. Roads crumbled underfoot. The river's course shifted slowly, erasing paths long travelled. Nature, patient and unyielding, pressed forward where human hands withdrew. The city's great pulse slowed to a whisper, then to silence. Families that remained clung to memories like fragile threads. Old men and women recounted tales of glory and loss, their voices soft with the weight of years. Children listened, eyes wide but unable to grasp the full shape of the stories. The past became a distant shore, visible but unreachable. People spoke less of kings and battles, more of survival and waiting. The city's architecture, once a symbol of pride and power, became a backdrop to quiet despair. Streets cracked and buildings leaned with age. The ziggurat, once a mountain reaching toward the sky, wore the scars of time. Vines crept along its sides, slowly weaving it into the earth. In this slow decay, Babylon was not destroyed. It was surrendered. The empire that had given it life had moved on, leaving only whispers in the dust. Beyond the city, new powers rose and fell. The memory of Babylon softened with each passing generation. Scholars in faraway lands studied its history, writing in languages Babylonian scribes never knew. The city's name carried weight in stories and scrolls, but less so in the daily lives of those who lived on its ruins. The lands around Babylon became quieter. Travelers passed without pause. Traders chose other routes. The river that had once carried life and wealth now moved with a gentle indifference. Time itself seemed to fold around the city, wrapping it in layers of forgetfulness. Yet even in collapse there was a strange beauty. The slow unraveling held its own rhythm, a mournful song sung by stone and wind. Babylon's end was not a single moment but a long farewell, spoken softly over centuries, and in the quiet that followed, beneath the fading stars, the city held its breath. Not in hope, not in fear, but in remembrance. A memory of fire and water, of kings and gods, of triumph and loss. Babylon was no longer a city of power. It was a city of stories. And those stories, whispered by the wind through broken walls and empty streets, lived on. They carried the weight of all who had walked there, loved, dreamed, fought, and fallen. The collapse was complete, yet it was also a beginning. A space where silence held the echoes of a world once bright, now gone to rest. Memory is a fragile thing. It lives not only in books or tablets, but in the silence between words, in the spaces carved by time and forgetting. After the fall, Babylon's stories passed from voice to voice, sometimes clear, often blurred, like a river reshaping its banks with every turn. The people who once called the city home carried its legacy in their hearts, even as the stones beneath their feet crumbled and the skies above shifted. Memory became both a shield and a burden. To remember was to hold on, but also to feel the weight of loss. Those who survived spoke quietly of kings and gods, of gardens that bloomed beneath desert suns, of festivals that once lit the night with fire and music. These stories, though faded, were threads tying past to present, weaving a tapestry of identity that refused to unravel completely. Scholars and travelers who came centuries later found fragments of Babylon scattered across the sands. Clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform told tales of laws, battles, and daily life. But these texts, once living voices, had grown silent. Their meanings were locked behind language no longer spoken, waiting for patient hands to decode their secrets. The memory of Babylon transformed through time, from a living city to an ancient legend, to a symbol of human achievement and fragility. Each generation read it anew, colored by its own hopes and fears. For some, Babylon was a warning of pride undone. For others, it was a testament to endurance, a reminder that even great empires can be both magnificent and mortal. The city's memory lived not only in history books, but in the human heart, a mirror reflecting the cycles of rise and fall. In distant lands, poets wrote of Babylon's lost splendor. Artists painted its towering walls and hanging gardens, though few had seen them with their own eyes. Musicians composed melodies inspired by its stories, carrying echoes of a city long gone but never forgotten. These creative acts became a kind of living memory, one that transformed the city from stone and dust into a symbol breathing anew with each telling. Yet alongside admiration lay sorrow. The memory of Babylon held a quiet sadness, the sadness of what could never be recovered. The gardens, the temples, the bustling streets, all existed now only in dreams and fragments. To remember was also to mourn. This mourning shaped how the city was remembered, teaching lessons about power's impermanence and the cost of ambition. Even the land around Babylon carried memory in its silence. The river still flowed, though changed, and the earth bore the marks of human hands. Old foundations, sunken walls, forgotten pathways. Bedouin tribes passed down stories of the city in the desert night. Their tales, woven with myth and history, kept Babylon alive across centuries. Travelers paused to gaze at the ruins, feeling the weight of time in the cracked bricks and worn stones. For some, the memory was a place of wonder. For others, a place of quiet reflection on the passage of all things. Memory did not restore what was lost. It did something else. It preserved the possibility of connection across time, a reminder that no matter how far the world changes, the past remains part of the present. In the quiet moments before sleep, as shadows lengthen and the mind drifts, the memory of Babylon lingers. It is a whisper beneath the stars, a soft echo of a city that once held the world's gaze. It is a story told in silence, in the pause between breaths, where history becomes personal. To remember Babylon is to remember the fragile beauty of human endeavor. The light and shadow intertwined, and though the city no longer stands as it once did, its memory endures, a gentle flame flickering in the darkness, inviting us to listen, to learn, and to dream. What remains after the fire is never the same as what came before. When the walls crumble and the voices fade, what is left is a quietness shaped by loss and memory. Babylon, once the heart of an empire, now lies beneath layers of earth and time, hidden but not erased. Its stones whisper secrets to those who listen. Secrets of power and pride, of love and betrayal, of beginnings and endings that echo through history like distant thunder. The city that stood at the crossroads of the world gave way to change, but it did not vanish entirely. Instead, it became a place where past and present meet in the shadows, where the silence between ruins tells stories louder than any trumpet or sword. The river, which once brought life and trade, continues its patient flow. It carries with it the dust of forgotten kings and the hopes of those who lived and dreamed beside its banks. The gardens, though long since gone, live on in imagination, in poems, paintings, and the quiet longing of those who wish to touch something lost. The great ziggurat no longer reaches toward the sky, but its memory remains a symbol of humanity's reach for the divine, the desire to build something lasting in a world that shifts beneath every step. What remains is not stone or brick, but something softer, more enduring. The echo of a city's heart beating faintly in the minds of those who remember. In the fields and villages around Babylon, new lives grew from the ashes of the old. People moved on, as they always do. They carried with them fragments of culture, language, and faith, weaving these threads into new tapestries of existence. The land changed hands, but the human spirit endured, shifting like the river's course but never breaking. To live after a fall is to hold space for both grief and renewal. It is to understand that endings are also beginnings, that silence carries its own kind of wisdom. Babylon's fall was not just a moment of destruction, but a slow unfolding, a passage from one chapter of history into another. Today, travelers and scholars stand on the edges of what was once Babylon, tracing its outlines in stone and shadow. They speak its name with reverence and curiosity. Archaeologists unearth fragments that speak across millennia, piecing together stories from shards and dust. These discoveries remind us that history is not lost, only waiting to be found again, understood anew. What remains is a dialogue between past and present, a conversation that asks us to listen deeply and respectfully. The ruins teach patience. They teach humility. They invite us to see ourselves not as masters of time, but as its caretakers. And so, as the sun sets on this story, we are left with a quiet invitation to remember, to dream, to carry forward the lessons whispered by ancient walls. Babylon's fall was a moment of great change, but it was also a moment of reflection, a reminder that power is fragile, that memory shapes identity, and that from loss, new stories grow. The city's legacy is not only in the stones beneath our feet, but in the hope that even after the darkest nights, dawn will come. What remains after the fire is a chance to listen, to understand, and to sleep gently beneath the stars, cradled by the past and the promise of tomorrow.